if you tick all the boxes of these requirements, you could have a house that is on a really steep site. So there would be no step-free pathway to your entry door. And then your entry door might be wide enough for a wheelchair, but in this case, you wouldn't actually get a wheelchair to that door. And then you just have a toilet on the ground floor. And that toilet might have a certain, the 900 by 1200 in front of it, which might let a wheelchair into the bathroom, but I'm not sure about transferring onto the toilet. Also, there's no requirements to have the grab rails in the first place installed. So that visitor in a wheelchair wouldn't be able to use that toilet probably. And then there's no other requirements if you don't have any other rooms on that ground floor. So in essence, you could end up with a house on a steep site with steps and ramps and whatnot to get to the front door, and just have a toilet on that ground floor that complies. And that would be it. And you would tick all the boxes, deemed to satisfy. That would be it.
Well, Jenna, it is so awesome to have you here. Finding you was the result of a very long hunt for my team and I to find somebody that could really speak to some of the changes that have been made to the National Construction Code. From a point of view, I'm hoping that homeowners will be able to understand the relevance of it to their own life and their own situation, regardless of what their own physical requirements might be or what their long-term plans and intentions for their home might be. And it was funny because when we were researching about who could we bring on and who was going to be able to be super helpful and do it in a way where it didn't feel like it was all just about these things being applied to you by some legislation that really is of no interest to you, we were finding it really hard to find somebody that we thought we could bring on. So I'm really, really excited to be able to meet you and to have you here and to be able to share you with the Undercover Architect community, because I know that your work and what you do on a day-to-day basis has a lot of relevance for so many people, and for the Undercover Architect community to get an insight to that and then to see how it might apply to their own projects as they're thinking about building and renovating is going to be really, really awesome. And then, of course, to understand the role that the updates to the National Construction Code 2022 are making in all of that decision making as well. So before we dive in, though, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing at Honeycomb Access and Design.
Of course. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me and inviting me. Since you invited me, I've been really enjoying your podcast and all the episodes. So I'm excited to use the home method when I do my renovation in a few years, hopefully. So yeah, I started Honeycomb now about 3 years ago, and my background's in architecture. I am nearly registered. I've done the exam, I've passed, and I'm about to actually sign the forms and register as an architect finally.
Oh, congratulations. That's massive.
Thank you. Yes, very exciting. And I guess my journey started when I was studying architecture, and I was really enjoying it, but I found there wasn't enough connection to people, and specifically people with disability. And my interest and passion in working in the disability sector started when I was in high school, where I just became friends with a girl who I'm still friends with today, and she has an intellectual disability. And we bonded, created a friendship, and I realized there were so many more people who could benefit from social experiences like her. So when I finished school, my now husband and I and some friends started a charity called Flying Fox, which is about to turn 10. And Flying Fox is a charity that supports young people with intellectual disability, creating social fun opportunities for them. I think to date they've supported, well, I say they because I'm not so involved on the ground anymore, but about 1,500 people with and without disability.
Wow.
So it's a fantastic organisation. I'm definitely biased, but founding that charity alongside studying architecture definitely made me think about how architecture can fit into the disability sector. So I literally Googled architecture and disability, and I found a man who works as an access consultant, and I went to work for him. And yeah, since have been working for an access consulting firm and an architecture firm, and then went out on my own a few years ago.
That's so exciting. And thank you for sharing your story. I love hearing these stories of how these personal experiences really compel you to do architecture in a different way in the world, and how that can really then come about, sort of really growing something that's absolutely incredible, and I'm sure life-changing for loads of people. So I know that when I studied architecture, it was a long time ago at the University of New South Wales, it's like you said, I remember only just doing one exercise that looked at accessibility, and it was we had to break into groups of 3, and one of us, I think, was in a wheelchair, one of us was wearing goggles that gave you a particular type of visual
I think
impairment.
they're still doing this exercise. Yeah.
And yeah, we had to get from one end of campus to the other. And it was at the time when University of New South Wales just had, I mean, I think it still does, the big stairs through the middle. So you literally we had to actually get a map of the university campus that I'd been on for several years to find all of the pathways through the various buildings, to then go in lifts, to then go up to the next level, to come out at a different exit, to be able to bypass the stairs that everybody else got to take through the middle of campus. And it was incredible. And I know when halfway through my degree, I was traveling overseas. I broke my leg and had to have a massive knee reconstruction. And so for my next semester, I was on crutches for about 7 months with a big knee brace and everything like that. And our project was a big kind of greenfield project, and I couldn't even have a look at the site, So it was just this thing of like, you don't even, when we think of accessibility requirements, we think of people in wheelchairs, people who are permanently disabled and dealing with physical hindrances to their ability to move about the world. But, I, like somebody like me who just ended up being on crutches for 7 months, just, and it impacted everything in my life for that period of time. That was really, really challenging. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And parents with prams. And it's interesting what you say, because there are certainly not enough architects with disability, with lived experience. And I think that is partly because of the physical accessibility of the universities, but also the courses. So I'm about to embark on a project at Melbourne University to try and work on some of those issues. But that's probably a whole nother podcast.
That sounds exciting. I'll have to get you back on for that one. That one sounds amazing. So Honeycomb Access and Design, you provide a range of services from design consulting through to preparing performance solutions, also livable housing assessments. So when it comes to individual residential homes, which is what most of the Undercover architect community are doing, they're thinking about their new build or the renovation project. What does it look like if they wanted to work with Honeycomb Access and Design? How do you get involved, and when do you get involved, and how do you sort of work with people? Because I know you do a big range of project types. What does it look like in regards to an individual home?
Yeah, so obviously it does depend on the family and the home. I've done a lot of home modifications and designed sensory gardens, and done modifications to bathrooms, and also done the compliance stuff, like you said, LHA. I work with NDIS provisions as well for SDA, and lots of apartment buildings. And so obviously the client is the main point of call for each project, and it depends on what the family needs. In the context of this new livable housing design standard, I'd say the best way to involve a consultant like myself would be early on in the process. And I think we would say that for any service that Honeycomb provides, the earlier on the better, so that we can give advice that's going to really carry the project through to construction with as little issues as possible. So yeah, I'd say looking at the concept before it goes to planning, and then making sure that all of those provisions are really maintained up until the point that the surveyor or the certifier gets involved, and up until completion.
Okay. And I'm sure we'll hear more as we go on about what some of that problem solving and some of that advice might look like, because I can imagine, that with your architectural knowledge and experience and training, there's a whole nother layer of opportunity in terms of how you might look at things alongside the accessibility and those kinds of things. So I think it's going to be really good to dive into that.
Yeah.
I want to just chat about the National Construction Code 2022 for a moment, though. The changes that have been made, there's a big update, obviously, and we've been going through in this series talking largely about the environmental sustainability and condensation management, all of those kinds of building envelope and thermal changes that have been made. But there's obviously a significant update in terms of the accessibility requirements and what's been called livable housing. So in the people that you're speaking with, in colleagues, in speaking to clients and things like that, how are you finding people are wrapping their heads around these changes? Obviously, they've not been adopted in every state just yet. And we're still seeing that those timelines seem quite extended for some locations around the country. How do you see people are kind of taking these on board, and do you feel like these changes are actually moving things in the right direction, or is there anything that's still missing that that you think is sort of a great big gaping hole in what we need to consider when it comes to our building codes and regulations in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. Big question. Great questions. Yes, it's definitely a big update. And with any update, I think the construction industry goes like, we've got this big transition. What do we do? I think for homeowners, they should be reassured that most of the changes aren't that drastic. And I think in 10 years' time, we're going to look back and go, oh my gosh, like, why did we freak out about this? It's really minor. I think the biggest change is probably to do with the entrance to the house being step-free. So I live in a 1920s house, and there are 2 little steps to get in. And those 2 little steps are okay for an able-bodied person, but as soon as you have a pram or someone who's older trying to get in, it's just such a pain. So there are a lot of benefits that I think we'll all feel with the change. And then a lot of the other things that are implemented are really quite minor for most cases. We can talk in detail in a moment. I might just kind of take a step back and talk a little bit of context, if that's
That'd be
okay.
perfect. Thank you. Yep.
So I guess without diving too deeply into the problem, and to keep it simple, we know in Australia that there is a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis, and it's only worsening. And this crisis disproportionately impacts older adults and people with disability, I guess due to housing affordability, availability, but also accessibility. So in Victoria, we have the big housing build, which includes requirements for all new public housing to meet certain accessibility requirements, but that's really Livable Housing Australia. So it's more, livability more than, I'd say, accessibility. So more catering to people to age in place or adapt their homes more easily. We also have the Better Apartment Design standards, which includes some accessibility features, and it's required for about 50% of apartments. But I really question some of those features, and there are still lots of gaps within those standards. So up until now, for single residences, single dwellings, your class 1A, we've had no accessible requirements or features. So in 2017, the government went, okay, let's do something about this. We know we've got the LHA standards, so why don't we think about adapting that into the NCC? And so in 2021, the Commonwealth, state and territory building ministers agreed to do this. But as you said, not all states are opting in. Some have opted out. So we know that New South Wales and WA currently are not going to adopt the standards, which is pretty upsetting. And I think Northern Territory and Queensland have already adopted it, but it is going to be a slow process, because if someone's already started a design for their home before that adoption date, so before the 1st of October this year in those 2 states, then their certifier or surveyor will probably still be assessing their home under the previous NCC. So it's still going to take some time, and we don't have so much knowledge yet of how it's all rolling out. I spoke to a certifier in Queensland yesterday, for example, and he said, yep, it's been around since October, but we haven't yet had one because of that retrospective application. So I think time will tell what this all looks like, and I think we will adapt, and I think the transition will feel less scary as time moves on. So I think the other interesting thing just to point out here is that, they're really not enabling accessibility for someone with a typical disability, say someone in a wheelchair. So if you tick all the boxes of these requirements, you could have a house that is on a really steep site, so there would be no step-free pathway to your entry door. And then your entry door might be wide enough for a wheelchair, but in this case, you wouldn't actually get a wheelchair to that door. And then you just have a toilet on the ground floor, and that toilet might have a certain, the 900 by 1200 in front of it, which might let a wheelchair into the bathroom, but I'm not sure about transferring onto the toilet. Also, there's no requirements to have the grab rails in the first place installed, so that visitor in a wheelchair wouldn't be able to use that toilet probably. And then there's no other requirements if you don't have any other rooms on that ground floor. So in essence, you could end up with a house on a steep site with steps and ramps and whatnot to get to the front door, and just have a toilet on that ground floor that complies. And that would be it. And you would tick all the boxes, deemed to satisfy, that would be it. Obviously, that's not your typical home. And so most homes, say on one level, would have a nice step-free pathway to the front door. You could get through the front door, you'd have your 820 clear opening, and then the corridors would be at least 1 meter, and you'd have a little bit of space in front of you, in front of your toilet. You'd have a shower in the corner of the room that was hobless and step-free. And that's pretty much it. So I think the entrance and possibly that toilet on the ground floor. So for some people, it's like the powder room if they've got a 2-level house. Those would be the things to think about that might change how they were initially planning their renovation or their new build.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, I think that I think you make a really good point, and I want to dive into that a little bit further into our conversation about livable and accessible not being the same thing. And I think this is the thing, is that what I'm seeing in the conversations online, particularly from those that are super resistant to these updates, is that there's a confusion between what those requirements are for compliance versus what accessibility requirements might traditionally be. And so I think it's really good to sort of unpack this in more detail. I'm going to read out some of the stuff that I actually said right back at the beginning of this NCC update series, because I had a couple of episodes at the beginning that went through the structure of the change, because obviously the change to the structure of the National Construction Code has been a really big change that everybody professionally has had to wrap their head around, which is largely about being able to bring the NCC into an online interactivity a lot more effectively. And it's been really fascinating. I think, I recorded that episode obviously some time ago. I've been inside the NCC 2022 a lot more since then. And it does work so much better for interacting with in an online environment.
Pasting things in an email and finding the reference images, and I do
using the internal search and everything. Yeah, it's just it's made life a lot easier. And then I had another episode which was just basically going through the specific changes. So it was episode 286, and I said the ABCB standard provides a set of technical provisions that, if complied with, enable dwellings to better meet the needs of the community, including older people and people with mobility limitations. It's not an exact replication of the Livable Housing Design Guidelines. And I've been talking about the Livable Housing Design Guidelines for some time inside Undercover Architect. They've been a really great resource for loads of people who are looking at renovating or building. They've got elderly parents who might be moving in, or they've got, they know that they want to age in place. And so they're thinking about how do they need to accommodate that in their planning for their home. And those Livable Housing Guidelines have been a really great kind of pathway for them to know of the things to be aware of. I also said that it doesn't match AS 1428.1, Design for Access and Mobility General Requirements for Access, new building work, and it doesn't intend to. So it may not accommodate all needs, which is what you've just touched on. It's intended to be helpful in the majority of cases for occupants. And the document that is the Livable Housing addendum to the NCC that needs to be navigated is not intended to be read in isolation. You have to refer to it when you're navigating the NCC. It's similar to the Livable Housing Guidelines silver level requirements, and the ABCB apparently intends to publish a non-mandatory version that is based on the gold level requirements, so that you can apply for a higher level voluntarily if you actually want to. The standard is covering, and you touched on some of these things, so dwelling access, so arriving at the dwelling from the street, the dwelling entrance, so entering the home itself, internal doors and corridors to assist with movement through the home, the sanitary compartment, which is that downstairs bathroom or wet area, relating to toilet location and access, the shower and its access, and then reinforcement of bathroom and sanitary compartment walls to assist with accessibility in that zone as well. So I wanted to dive into some of these individual areas with you and just tap into your kind of knowledge and you know, any tips that you can give the Undercover Architect community. If we look firstly at the accessible pathways of travel, so those will include changes to the door widths, the hallway widths, the level travel pathways from the car or the entry into the home. So what are your tips and things to remember and what you're seeing in the field with clients in regards to design and approvals when it comes to accessible pathways of travel?
Sure. So I think, yeah, as I mentioned, that step-free access path is probably the scariest change for builders and homeowners, partly because of the waterproofing requirements. But we are seeing a lot of options for how to do that. So having different drainage systems and doing, you know, strip drains and having falls in the right direction. I think just planning for that early on is just the best way to go about that. There is also a requirement for a covered area or, you know, a landing porch or something in front of the front door, which I think most homes already do have. I think anyone who designs their front door without that, it's really rare, because, you know, you have your shopping and you're trying to get into the house and you want somewhere to put things. And so I'd
Those
say
Amazon
most houses
deliveries
do
that
have.
get left at home.
Yeah, exactly. All the Amazon deliveries or Temu. I've been doing a lot of Temu shopping lately. Yeah, so it needs to be left somewhere that's covered. So I think most homes have that anyway. So a few things on that. I'd say the step-free path, I'd say, would be my favorite requirement. It's really going to be helpful to parents who have prams, older people, and then, you know, maybe not the residents living with disability, but having a friend come over. So I had a friend come over for came over recently, and she's in a wheelchair, and we're lucky that we've got two big double doors, so we could just open both doors to get her wheelchair through. But it would be really nice if there was a nice level step-free pathway to get into the house to be able to accommodate that. So I think that's a requirement it is a bit annoying, and it's going to be tricky to navigate at first, but we're going to have a lot of precedents and ways to overcome that, and then everyone will really enjoy this requirement. And then, yeah, so that step-free access path can be from a car park or the garage, if you can't provide it from the footpath. And then if you've got a really steep site, you don't have to satisfy this requirement. There is an exemption for it. So I think a lot of homes in Sydney or Queensland would probably be facing some of those challenges, those site challenges. And so, yeah, they've acknowledged that, and there is an exemption there. Ramps on a step-free path of travel are allowed, but the landing for those ramps can't be on a footpath. So that, again, it's just a detailed thing that should just be workshopped as early as possible in the design phase. But the entry door, and there are some differences to the LHA standards, the entry door is allowed to be made up of multiple doors. So you could have your, you know, 700 door, but there's another portion of that door that will make up the 820. So a bifold door or just multiple doors or double doors, that's allowed. The other difference I noticed from LHA is the threshold ramp. So if you have a slight, you know, internal floor area that's raised, you can have a threshold ramp from your landing outside the front door to your internal floor area via a threshold ramp. LHA says that the maximum can be 56. This standard doesn't talk about a maximum. It just says that threshold ramp has to be the depth and width of the door jamb. But if you had a really large door jamb, what's to say that your internal height wouldn't be more than 56? So I guess that's another
little... no grade, because normally an accessible ramp needs to be a 1 in 14 grade in that 1428.
Yes. So this one says 1 in 8.
Okay. Right, which is still, it's
1 in
quite steep,
8.
isn't it? So yeah.
Yeah, which is steep, but it's normally to allow for a level change of, yes, 30 mils to 40 mils is the most common one, I'd say. And so these door requirements only apply to doors on the ground floor. So if you've got double story or more, then the doors on those upper levels don't have to have that 820 opening. And mostly specifying like an 870 leaf would get you that 820 clearance. But I think there is a misconception about the clearance. So it's measured when the doors open in a 90-degree position. So if you have a door leaf that's, say, 920, your clear open width is going to be maybe 870. So you always have to specify a door leaf that's greater. But I'd say most architects or draftspeople working on this would know that. Also, there is an allowance for split levels, so you can have a drop or a split level on your ground floor. And a small difference as well I noticed between these standards and LHA is that the 1 meter corridor requirement is between the walls, not the skirtings. So you could have a 1 meter corridor measured between the walls, and then you could have your skirts beyond that. And so if you measured between the skirts, sometimes they can be quite thick. But this is all intended for new builds, and I'd say that means it's a lot easier to apply than retrospectively renovating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that thing, isn't it, that if you don't think about the dimensions first before you start designing that lower floor plan, then you could get yourself into real trouble once you hit your compliance requirements, because if you haven't accommodated the hallway widths at the sizes that you want, or you haven't planned for the rooms to have doors at the required width that they need, then that can become really problematic to try and shuffle everything around after the fact. And I think too, that accessible pathway to the front door has been one that a lot of people have balked at when they've thought about, well, what, I live on a sloping site, what am I going to do? But as you say, if you can obviously have it from the car parking space, from the garage. And so I think it makes really good sense in terms of, like you say, it's not just for the friend that might be visiting or the elderly relative or those kinds of things, but even just, I think of the times I've tried to move a fridge or a piano in and out of a house, just little logistics that you have to go through because you've got stairs between, you don't have any ability to, you've got to navigate a bunch of stairs, and sometimes you're doing that down side pathways because you know that you can get up the side of the house and through big doors on the back of the house, but then you've got to get past rainwater tanks or things like that. So a lot of this actually does set up the house for greater functionality overall in terms of moving items in and out. And it, of course, makes your home more inclusive for people who might be visiting, and also for you, in terms of those things, those unexpected injuries, or if life changes in terms of who might be living in the home and where they're at. So the bathrooms and wet areas. So some of the changes, they're obviously going to impact the size of the spaces and the layout of the spaces to allow kind of the room around toilets, as you said, the detailing of hobless showers, the construction choices for retrofitting grab rails down the track, because as you said earlier, it's not a requirement to have those up front, but you need to obviously be able to build in the capacity to do that. So what are your tips in regard to this and things that people need to remember when they're thinking about the bathrooms and their wet areas?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, with the shower, I'd say without even looking at the standards and the requirements, you would probably design your shower to these standards at this point. I think most people now are doing a step-free hobless shower. And there is an allowance for a lip. A lip is not considered a hob, so you can have something that prevents the water, like a 5 mil rounded channel or something that's holding the shower screen. That's not considered a hob. So as long as the waterproofing is done without the hob and without a step, then there is a little bit of flexibility around a screen. And that shower can be, on any level. It doesn't have to be on the ground level. The toilet, yes, is required on the ground level, but, and I don't know this for certain, but I think in Queensland there are some concessions for that. So I can look into that further, but just from conversations, I've heard that there is something there.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, so
Queensland's interesting because it's actually referring the Queensland Development Code. It's not referring to the NCC. It's kind of adopted these changes inside a different format that you need to review. And then that format has actually been the thing that the Master Builders Association has then campaigned with the government to have amended and adjusted for Queensland housing, quite separate to the NCC. And I was seeing, I got to see draft copies of MBA's comments on that document prior to it being kind of finalised. And it's so weird. Like you see at this
just
point in
to
time,
add confusion.
you see at this point in time, like we're one country under one federal government, but we're not.
No.
So it's this kind of odd thing, which it's so challenging. But and I think I totally get it when it's related to climate and housing types and things like that. But when it's something like this that actually impacts kind of the way people can move in and out about their homes, I'm not quite sure why it needs to be on a state-by-state basis. So, but yeah, so that's why Queensland's sort of a little bit of a satellite one to the NCC. So yeah, and you can see that obviously.
Concession may indeed.
Yeah,
exist.
You would have seen that in your, when you go into the ABCB website and it's got the state, the different dates that the state's adopting it, and you get to Queensland, and it doesn't have dates. It's actually just got a reference to this different document that it's incorporated these things into. So yeah.
Yes. Okay. I found a couple of typos or mistakes on that anyway. So some of the adoption dates in that table are different to the state government's website on the adoption timelines.
Yeah.
So, well, actually, while we're on that, I might just share the dates that I found in my most recent search. So, Northern Territory and Queensland apparently adopted already from the 1st of October 23. The next in line will be ACT, 15th of Jan 2024. Victoria's due for 1st of May 24. South Australia and Tas is due for 1st of October 24. And as I said, unfortunately, New South Wales and WA at this stage are not adopting it. So yes, so back to bathrooms. The requirement for grab rails is not there. It's just to reinforce the walls so that they can be provided in the future. And I'd say on reinforcing that, generally, I'd say sheeting provides more flexibility than noggins. And you can also reinforce walls with cavity sliders. There is a requirement for baths that if there is a bath required, then you have to reinforce the wall adjacent to that bath. But if the bath is freestanding, then you don't need to. So if you want to provide a bath and you don't want to add reinforcement, then make it a freestanding bath.
Undercover architect listeners will know that I do not like freestanding baths. So
no. Why is that?
I just find that they always get squeezed in spaces where they don't have enough room around them to provide decent maintenance. And
yes. Okay.
So yeah. So
I've never had one, so I can't. Yes, but I can understand that cleaning those small spaces just accumulates dust, and fair enough. The toilet doesn't actually have to be in the corner of a room, so you could have your, I'm just thinking to my my first home, we had an ensuite, and it was that typical sort of basin, then toilet, then shower, and so the toilet's not next to a wall, but there are certain clearances that you'd need to do to have the toilet centered between those two features, and then have at least 900 clearance, and you would reinforce the back wall to allow for a fold down grab rail. So that's another little thing to keep in mind. If you did have bedrooms on the ground floor and you wanted to satisfy that requirement via one of, say, the en-suites, you could do that in this way. I think if you're looking at a house design that has all the bedrooms upstairs, and so on the ground level, you've got your powder room, I'd say that's probably where your design would possibly differ to satisfy these requirements, because getting that 900 by 1200 zone in without the basin encroaching that, your little squeezy powder room becomes a little bit different. So that could be a little bit annoying, but I'd say, again, designing it out early on, figuring out how to do, maybe a little recessed basin that tucks into the next room, which could be the laundry or the pantry or something like that, or the garage. would probably mean you could design something still really beautiful that fits into that puzzle slot really well. So yeah, I think when you read the standards for the first time, it looks very overwhelming and technical and involved, but when you unpack it and actually see it in a design, it doesn't look like there's anything so significant. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice. And I think that's the thing is that, yeah, I suppose we haven't experienced this level of constraint and rule making around how we might plan some of these dimensions and spaces previously. And I think that's probably going to be the first. A lot of homeowners are obviously wanting to know, what are the recommended sizes for this? I teach them inside my programs based on design experience, what should this space sort of roughly be for it to work and function and those kinds of things. How much space should you have around a toilet just so that it's not too big and it doesn't feel too squeezy. Then to have this other layer of compliance over the top of it in terms of those dimensions, I think that's where people may feel a little bit like it feels prickly. And it's just that, oh gosh, it's just another thing to think of in the thousands and thousands of things that I need to think of when I'm navigating my project. But as you say, once you actually read through it, it's not the impact is not so significant on a new build. And it's obviously only applying to new builds at the moment. And I think it's just then that thing, as you say, early on, designing it in. And if you find that you are on a challenging site, like a sloping site or some sort of arrangement that's going to make them difficult, then working with your team to figure out what that compliance pathway is.
But I think adaptability is a really big topic, to think about how we can age in place and adapt our homes to suit our changing needs into the future. I'm sure there'll be something to consider for, how we can have robots move around the house in probably, a year's time. Or some people, prioritize privacy, others prioritize functionality. Some people want to put their laundry upstairs because all the bedrooms are upstairs. So you can just, do the laundry and then fold it and deliver it to all the rooms whilst you're upstairs. But then that doesn't really accommodate for if you have to move downstairs into the future. Depends on the family, depends on the situation, but lots to think about.